Hello, everybody. Welcome to the talk today. My name is Leah, and I'm here representing Bay Nature. Bay Nature is a nonprofit, independent nature media organization based in Berkeley, and we cover nature and conservation topics and around the 9 counties of the Bay Area through our print magazine and our newsletter, as well as our online talks and walks. And so today we're all joining for a talk featuring Anton Sorokin. But before we begin, I just want to invite you all to turn your cameras on. This is going to be a fun, interactive conversation and discussion with Anton. So please feel free to turn your cameras on and just join in. We look forward to seeing you and seeing you participate. So thanks to you all for joining. If you all if you would like to have free access to these kinds of talks, I invite you to become a Bay Nature member, which guarantees free admission to our talks as well as to our hikes. And we'll circulate a promo code later if you're interested in doing that. But now I will introduce our speaker, Anton Sorokin. Anton is a wildlife biologist, a freelance journalist, and a conservation photographer whose photos have been published in National Geographic, the New York Times, Ranger Rec Magazine, Audubon, and of course, Bay Nature. Anton's interests lie mostly in reptiles and amphibians, and he says he's always looking to help raise awareness of the natural world, its inhabitants, and the challenges they face. In April, Anton wrote a piece on snake fungal disease for Bay Nature, which will be the topic of our conversation today. So please turn your cameras on and ask your questions either by raising your hand, which is under the Reactions tab on Zoom, or feel free to type your questions into the chat. So we look forward to hearing your questions. But now I'm going to start with the first question with Anton, and we can begin. Hi, Anton.
Hi, thanks Leah for that introduction, and thanks to everyone at Bay Nature for having me here today. I'm excited to talk about snake fungal with everyone.
Yeah, we're really excited to have you here. So for our first question, for those who haven't read your piece, do you mind sharing a summary of the piece you wrote, what it was about, what people should know, and any big takeaways?
Right, so the piece focused on the arrival of a new disease here in the Bay Area of California, snake fungal disease, which has been known from the East Coast for several decades now. But recently, in 2019, it was found in California for the first time. The California Department of Fish and Wildlife started monitoring to see where in California it was, and it kind of came as a shock that they found it across most of the Bay Area counties, that it was a lot more prevalent than anybody had expected. And the piece kind of focused on its arrival here, what that might mean, what species have been affected. Pretty much almost all of our Bay Area species of snakes have been found to be infected, and the ones that haven't, it's probably just a lack of sampling effort so far. Just some species are hard to get your hands on.
Mhm.
And yeah, just kind of a general outlook of what might happen, but I'll save that summary for later because I know some of the other questions are probably going to get into that.
Mhm. Thank you. No, that makes really helpful. Um, from your standpoint, how do you see an issue like snake fungal disease potentially impacting Bay Area ecosystems as a whole?
Right. So anytime a new disease arrives anywhere, we've all lived through a pandemic. We know like kind of how quickly things can kind of like snowball out of control. So and snakes, even though like on a regular hike, just to walk outside, you probably aren't going to see any snakes. They're always around, and they're actually a really critical component of our ecosystems. They're mid-level predators. They eat a lot of different things, and they're also eaten in turn by a lot of predators: hawks, weasels, coyotes, foxes. Everything eats snakes, and you really don't want to start messing with any component of an ecosystem. I always relate it to like a Jenga tower. Like you can remove one little block, you can remove another one, and the entire tower may stay stable, but as you remove more components, everything's becoming destabilized and eventually everything could topple. So with snakes, even if we don't see like this huge collapse of all the snakes in the Bay Area, one thing that's of huge concern is it just if they gradually start declining and then various birds aren't going to have the same resources available to them. Some of the animals that snakes eat will also not have that control. We're unlikely to get overrun by like rodents or something like that, but at the same time, you never know without a mid-level predator taking care of mice. There's a paper from Australia not too long ago about the number of mice that snakes ate in an agricultural field over the course of a year. And it was, I can't quote exact numbers, but it was really impressive figure. And we have that same thing going on here in California. So we don't
Mm.
want to get rid of those mid-level predators and start kind of like jostling the ecosystem.
Oh, makes sense. You mentioned mid-level predators, so snakes are these mid-level predators then in our Bay Area ecosystem. So, and you mentioned birds, and so what are some of the species that snakes will interact with, I guess, that people might be more likely to see?
Right. So hawks are obviously the big one. A lot of people have seen either red-shouldered hawks or red-tailed hawks carrying a snake overhead.
Mm.
They eat a lot of snakes. I've been observing several hawk nests in the past where it seemed like two-thirds of their diet was some sort of snake. The mother would be bringing in gopher snakes, king snakes, garter snakes to feed her nestlings. And without that, like they're relatively easy for a hawk to catch. If she was missing like ground squirrels or missing little rodents, potentially the nest wouldn't have been successful. But like the snakes were a really key component of the diet.
Mm.
Just a day ago, somebody showed me a picture of a long-tailed weasel that was dragging a rubber boa. That was about the same size as the weasel.
Oh.
Like I've seen scales from snakes in fox poop before, so things aren't super picky when it comes to eating the snakes. And then in turn, the snakes are eating rodents. We've got a lot of different species here: voles, deer mice, rats.
Mm.
They're eating each other. King snakes eat all other snakes, whether that's rattlesnakes or gopher snakes or
Oh.
garter snakes,
Mhm.
lizards, and yeah, I mean they're not too picky.
That's so cool. Wow. That's really cool. Yeah. So even though we don't see them, they're playing a huge, huge role. Makes sense.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
They're secretive, and pretty much every environment that you go to has them. Even in like an urban backyard, you probably have like long-tailed snakes there, sharp-tailed snakes, sorry,
Mm.
which are these tiny little like worm-like snakes
Mhm.
that you'd never see unless you're specifically looking for them.
Mm. No, that's so cool. Thank you. Yeah. Um, to dive a little deeper into the snake fungal disease itself, I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about the history of the disease, how it spread. It seems like it potentially originated from the pet trade. How did that work, generally speaking, and what were the steps that led to the disease spreading the way it has?
Yeah, so this is a tricky question because it's still kind of an unraveling mystery. Nobody has all of the answers yet.
Hmm.
But there has been some research done. So the disease for the first time was discovered in 2006 over on the East Coast in a population of timber rattlesnakes. And after that, it people started looking and found it more widely across the East Coast, and it's been spreading gradually westward since. But where it arrived from, some researchers, including Jeff Lorch, one of the microbiologists whom I quoted in the article, he and his team, they were involved in looking at the different strains of the fungus across North America. And they found something like 80 different strains, and they were able to look at the genome and how diverged it was from other strains. And they found that the time of divergence was relatively recent, which to they that was evidence that it hasn't been here in our soil and in our snakes for thousands of years, that it's a relatively new introduction because it's kind of radiating outwards rapidly.
Mm.
And they were, yeah, so it could be from the pet trade that it arrived here. It could be we also live in a world that's become very globalized, like
Mm.
it can survive in soils. It could have been
Mm.
from something else. The pet trade is the likely culprit for kind of spreading it around initially, at least.
Mm.
Um, And just because, yeah, animals in captivity, they are oftentimes, especially during shipping, kept in kind of crowded conditions when
Mhm.
disease can easily spread from one animal to another. Then when people release their pets into the wild, when it no longer becomes convenient for them to have them, that's been linked to spread of the disease. Actually, CDFW, some of their positive cases of snake fungal disease here in California were in non-native species that were found. There was a milk snake from Contra Costa County, if I remember correctly.
Mm,
One of the other snakes that was found testing positive for it was a water snake from near Sacramento, which
mm,
the water snakes aren't native to this side of the U.S.
mm.
That's an established population out there.
Wow.
But long story short is it's a complicated question. I can talk a little bit about how it worked with the chytrid fungus in
Mhm.
amphibians because that scientists have known about that for a few decades longer than they have known about snake fungal. And
Mm,
kind of this developing story where 30 years ago, everyone was pointing the finger at an out of Africa hypothesis because they thought that chytrid had arrived from Africa. Then gradually that idea changed that, like, no, it was always here. It's just climate change has made animals more vulnerable to it. Then it shifted to yet another idea and yet another idea and another idea after that. And finally, right now, like our most up-to-date understanding is it actually might have originated in Korea, the problematic strain,
mm,
and that there are other strains that are actually native to other areas, but they've kind of recombined, and there's certain strains that do cause die-offs. But
mhm.
all that to say is that it's very hard to figure out exactly how it all happened after the fact. And our understanding is constantly changing. So, with snake fungal disease, what I expect will happen is in a couple decades, we'll have a better idea. But still, there's going to be new developments that change our understanding as time goes on.
Wow. It sounds like an unfolding saga, very complicated, but
Yeah.
it looks like we have a question in the chat from someone named Bill. Bill, would you like to unmute and ask your question? Or I can also um, ask it as well if you'd prefer. But Bill's question, or I can ask, let's see. Bill's question was, okay, I'll ask, what is the likelihood that some snakes could adapt to the presence of the fungus?
Actually, quite good. So the fungus isn't necessarily always fatal when it infects a snake. Sometimes its own immune system can kind of suppress it, and it can live happily ever after afterwards. Or if there's like a period later where its immune system is under stress, it can resurface and become problematic. So even out in the east, where they had those initial flare-ups of the of snake fungal, they've seen some recovery in some of the species that were affected. I believe there's some dens of timber rattlesnakes where almost all the snakes initially died off, and then over time they've been recovering, albeit relatively slowly. The problem is that, as always, it's not an isolated system. It's not just snake fungal that's affecting snakes. It's 1,000 different things. And then when you just add a little bit more pressure onto a population that maybe only has a small little bit of habitat left, is dealing with drought that it didn't evolve with, is dealing with perhaps invasive species, then that extra little nudge,
Mhm.
that extra little challenge for it to deal with is problematic. But there is a good chance that um, even many of our snakes out here in the West may not be particularly susceptible to it. So we kind of have to wait and see how things react.
Mhm.
But there is a good chance that things can adapt to it if we're
Mhm.
lucky.
Thank you. And thank you, Bill, for your question. We have another one from Anna. Anna, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. I was just wondering whether the snake fungal disease was likely to spread to other species. I assume some people are tracking that.
Yes. So it is not host specific. So what that means is that it can affect basically any type of snake. And in a lab setting, researchers have actually found that it can affect lizards as well. They were able to intentionally infect lizards, and so they saw that they could be the host as well. However, there's never been a wild lizard found that was infected with snake fungal disease, and it is very reptile specific. So it's never gonna, at least unless our understanding of it drastically changes, it's never gonna shift hosts from snakes to rodents or to birds or to mammals or to people or anything like that. But it does have the potential to infect any number of snake species.
Hmm. Thank you. And thanks for the question, Anna. Another question that I had was, so this fungal disease has been detected on specimens, it seemed like in the museum dating back to the 1940s, but it only recently got the designation emerging infectious disease. Can you tell us a bit about who gave this disease this new name? What does the disease need to be in order to get this classification? Why now? And what changed to make it, a larger concern, and how concerned should we be?
Right. So the term emerging disease is one that's used by epidemiologists just to kind of classify diseases that are either newly discovered, and that doesn't mean like last year, sometimes it's like a number of decades,
Hmm.
or are rapidly spreading into new areas or into new species. So this disease is doing both. Well, it checks all three. It was discovered in 2006, which in terms of like disease discovery is still relatively recent. It's spreading westward, and as it's spreading westward, it's infecting new species that it's never infected before. So it is something to be concerned about. Obviously, just anytime a disease rolls through, we don't quite know how various species are going to react to it. We don't know what effect it's going to have. So it's definitely something that we want to keep a close eye on. And there are still monitoring programs. There's quite a few people out east working with it. And now that it's here in California, I expect that more graduate students, more labs are going to also turn their attention
Mm.
to monitoring out here.
Mhm.
So it's definitely something to be aware of. I personally don't think that it's we should be yelling like end of the world, all snakes are going to go extinct out here in
Yeah,
California.
yeah.
However, it definitely does have the potential to do a lot of harm. So cautious observation is definitely the thing to do
Mm,
right now.
totally makes sense. And then I was wondering, you had mentioned the chytrid fungus earlier, but just kind of taking a step back and looking at fungus in general, can you give us some context on fungus diseases in animals? What makes a fungal pathogen concerning? Because there are examples like the white nose syndrome in bats or chytrid fungus in amphibians, but there also are some things where fungus can be a mild irritant at most. So can you give us some context about what makes a fungal pathogen concerning?
Right. Yeah. So most of us, when we think of fungal pathogens, we're probably like more used to thinking about things like athlete's foot, which is unpleasant, but it's not fatal.
Mm.
And recently, well, relatively recently, I would say in like the past 50 years or so, maybe a little less time than that, actually, we've seen a number of really serious fungal pathogens emerge in wildlife species. Now, fungus has always been a problem for plants, and I think agriculturally there's been like discussions for quite a long time about various problematic funguses that affect that. But in animals, it's this new thing. First, chytrid fungus in amphibians, which is there's two species of chytrids which are problematic. There's one that's only in Europe and has so far only affected salamanders and is more recent. And then there's the more famous, the Trachochytrium dendrobatitis, which affects frogs and has caused more species extinctions than any pathogen, fungal or otherwise, in recorded history.
Mm.
It's caused dozens of species of frogs to just blink out of existence.
Mm.
And yeah, fungal pathogens are really tricky in that they can persist in an environment with um, with their spores, which can survive in the absence of a host, depending on the fungal pathogen, because fungi are quite diverse as well. Like there's no, they're probably, yeah, they're far more diverse than like animals. And some of them, most of them don't cause disease, but some of them do. And some of them, the ones that do cause disease, they can actually insist in the soil or water for long periods. They are oftentimes not super host specific. So in the case of chytrid, it's really problematic because it doesn't follow normal disease dynamics where the population dips and then the fungus or the disease becomes relatively rare and the animals have a chance to recover. The problem here is that since it affects different species different ways, they get these reservoir hosts, which here in California with chytrid, it's bullfrogs. Yeah, they are not particularly affected by it, but they are constantly shedding it out into the environment, and our frog species, which are affected by it, then sicken and die. And it could potentially be the same with this snake fungal disease. There could be species that aren't really affected by it, can live their whole lives with it, but constantly shedding it out, where it's coming into contact with species that do react badly. And it's hard to treat fungal pathogens in the wild. It's relatively easy in captive animals. You can collect an animal and give it like some antifungal treatment and release it, and you'll have cured it. However, when you try to expand that across the landscape, it's almost impossible. Plus, there's a lot of beneficial fungi, so we can't just dump a broad antifungal into the ecosystem.
Right. Wow. That sounds very challenging to mitigate for, but it looks like we have a hand up from Carlos. Carlos, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Hard question, but any guesses or speculation about why we're seeing a number of fungal diseases in wildlife? Is it that we didn't notice it before, or is there something different going on in the world?
That is a really good question. And there are whole research papers kind of speculating about why we're seeing this increase. One of the things is definitely just we are looking more and we're better at recognizing them when we find them. So for example, this snake fungal manifests in a snake oftentimes as these like yellow scabs covering the face and like lesions, which in the past somebody might have looked at and just been like, this snake is scarred up. Or I don't know, they wouldn't have necessarily occurred to them that it might be a fungal pathogen. But now that we know to explore that a little bit, we're finding more and more. Another idea is that they are able to, depending on the fungus, both reproduce asexually or sexually. And sometimes the same fungus can do either or. And so when they reproduce sexually, they're able to recombine and there's more selection. There's more selection for virulence in certain cases, so because you get more genetic variability. So again, I don't have like a solid answer as to why we're seeing more, but this is something that people have noticed, and there are certain papers published on it. Yeah, also the fact that we live in a globalized world, things are traveling across the world from place to place like they never have before. So your different strains are coming into contact with each other like they never have before.
Thank you. Thank you, Anton, and thank you, Carlos, for your question. We also have a question from Mary Ellen King. Mary, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, I was wondering what if when we're out in the field hiking or whatever and we run across snakes, is there any particular kind of behavior that might be an indicator that we're looking at a critter that's under stress from this?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. The fungus affects behavior in really subtle ways that are hard to see. So some of the research papers on it, they found that the snakes were more likely to spend more time basking out in the open, trying to recover from this disease. And when they're basking, they're more vulnerable to predators like the hawks that I mentioned earlier. However, if you're just walking and you're hiking and you see a snake basking, I mean, it's almost impossible to tell. Like, is this just a healthy snake thermoregulating, basking after a big meal, or is this a sick snake that's basking more than it normally would because it's infected with fungal disease? The things to look out for while you're hiking and when you come across a snake is if there's a snake that has like really crusty yellowed scales. That first sick snake that was ever found in California in 2019 was a king snake that its entire head was kind of a scabbed mess. It was blind, it couldn't eat, and it was obviously a very sick snake. So if you see lots of like yellow scales on it, that might be an indicator that it's a sick snake. If like that initial king snake, it was like kind of blindly moving around, no clue of where it was going, that's a pretty dead giveaway. However, normally with a mild infection, I don't know that there's anything that you could see and know like, okay, boom, that there is snake fungal disease. It's more subtle and hard to see.
I mean, among the snakes that were swabbed by CDFW, do you know like if what portion of the ones were swabbed also had some sort of visual indicator that kind of gave away that they were feeling unwell?
I don't know what proportion. I know that some of them definitely had the scabbing, and if you go and look at the article, that initial header image of the king snake that has like the yellow scabby scales, I know they swabbed some snakes like that ended up being positive, but I'm pretty sure they also swabbed some snakes that outwardly looked perfectly healthy and ended up testing positive for snake fungal disease.
Mm,
So it runs the whole spectrum of symptom manifestation.
totally. Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Mary Ellen, for your question. It looked like William, your question was pretty similar. So I'm gonna go to Deborah, also had a question. Deborah, do you want to unmute and ask your question? If not, I can also ask for you. Let's see. The question was, what has the long-term presence of the fungus on the East Coast population meant to the East Coast snake population?
That's a really good question. So again, I can't offer like a concrete answer because the longer term presence is still very short term when you look at the whole scope of things. So it's been a little less than 20 years. And we have seen some populations of snake, particularly pit vipers, decrease. And that could be because of the way that they overwinter in large groups for long periods of time. Or it could be something specifically about them that makes them more vulnerable. So some of the populations that declined following the introduction of snake fungal, they still are not back up to their pre-snake fungal levels. But we also haven't seen any species extinctions or anything like that, which is really good because, for example, with chytrid, which I mentioned before, it has driven many species to extinction. This so far is adding pressure to things, but it's not driving anything to the past the brink. But yeah, there's quite a few people working on it out there, and yeah, the verdict is still out. I think it's a gradual change over time that we're seeing.
Thank you. Mary Ellen King had another question follow-up. Mary, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, just in follow-up, if you're out in the field and you observe a snake that and you see some of those characteristics, obviously it's best to leave them alone, but is there any place that reporting any kind of sighting like that might be helpful?
Absolutely. So yeah, CDFW, they have a portal to submit any sort of unusual sightings. And the thing to do there is, if you're at all able, is to snap a picture of the snake, note the exact location, and then go onto their online portal and submit that you saw a potentially infected snake, that it had like the yellow scabbing or was acting weird. And Snakes are secretive. They may never be able to find that same individual again. However, if there's one infected snake in an area, there's probably more. And what they can do then is they can send staff or alert experts nearby who can then go and kind of explore the area, try to find other snakes, swab them, and kind of increase our understanding of where the disease even is, how it's spreading, because right now it's we still don't really have a complete map of where it is in the Bay Area. It seems to be widespread, but yeah, every record is important.
Thank you. Yeah. And we can also even in our follow-up email circulate that link to the CDFW page for reporting incidents too. But are there any other questions from anyone on screen or on the Zoom call? Feel free to just drop your questions in chat or unmute and just go ahead and ask. But yeah, thank you, Anton, for all of your expertise with this and for writing the piece.
Yeah, thanks for having me here today.
Yeah. Any questions from anybody on screen? Maybe not. Well, do you have any closing remarks, Anton? Anything you'd like to say? Oh, Mary Ellen asks, when was the date of the article? That was April. So it was actually just about a month ago, I think it was published.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, closing remarks. Just that the that snakes are such an important part of our landscape. Even if we don't see them, we should appreciate them and value them, and we should definitely just keep an eye on things. Again, I'd like to signal or like kind of end on an optimistic note. Like I said, it doesn't necessarily mean doom and gloom now that the disease is here. It does affect different snake species in different ways. And one thing that we haven't seen so far out here on the West Coast is these catastrophic declines like they did on the East Coast, like shortly after the fungus was found in timber rattlesnakes out there. Immediately the population in the following years plummeted. And we know that it's been out here since at least 2019. And even though it has become more widespread, we maybe cautious optimism is the outlook to have here. We haven't seen any catastrophic declines. That doesn't mean that we won't see gradual ones, but also, yes, one thing I didn't mention is like you don't want to move snakes across the landscape because that could facilitate disease spread. Because Jeffrey Lorch, the microbiologist who I interviewed for the piece, he really cautioned that the scary thing is when you start getting different strains that start kind of mixing together. And we don't know yet what strains are here in California. Is it just one strain? Is it two strains? Is it 10 strains? We don't really know. So that'll be something to keep an eye on, and how they mix and what ends up happening with that. But go out there, enjoy snakes. They're amazing.
Yeah, well, and the grant funding for the surveillance is actually coming to a close right through CDFW. So it really is helpful for people to, if they see something, to report it.
Right, yeah, because like I said, snakes are so secretive that even with like targeted research, going out and finding an individual snake is very difficult because it's probably 10 feet underground in like a gopher burrow or something like that. You can't necessarily find it. And there's relatively few scientists working on it, and the public's eyes are always so important for getting like a greater scope of things that they can never match. If everyone here in this presentation, if they went out and spent an hour outside, that would be so many hours out there and so many boots on the ground, which a small team just can't necessarily match.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I think with that we'll wrap up, and thank you so much, Anton. We appreciate you sharing your time and expertise with us. It was really, really great to learn about the snake fungal disease and the piece you wrote. Thank you so much for your time. And a reminder to all attendees that if you enjoyed this talk and would like to attend more, please become a Bay Nature member, and you can have free access to this content as well as to our Bay Nature hikes. So thank you all for attending, and thank you for your questions. And yeah, I appreciate you all being here today. Thank you.